Welcome back to part 2 of our data migration. In our previous video, we talked about moving and migrating Data Tools Pro out of Zoho into our brand new Salesforce partner organization. In that process, we exported our data out of Zoho, we ingested it into Snowflake, as you can see here, and then we set up our Data Tools Pro view of that data in an entity diagram. So now we know where we're getting our data from. We've staged it inside of Snowflake, and now we know exactly how our data is set up from a relationship perspective. I've already flagged this part of the process as complete, where we identified our source object, and now we're getting into data mapping. So if I click into leads, this is going to show me a live connected list of Salesforce fields that's coming from our destination. And I am going to refresh. Now, Data Tools Pro in the latest version will actually keep track of changes that occur in your Salesforce object. So when you are doing a migration and it's a fluid project and you're constantly adding or potentially even modifying fields, this will help you keep track of those items, certainly since we started this project. And this will give me some useful information like list view values, which we'll get into. So what we want to do now is actually map data from our Zoho data source into Salesforce. So I can start with any field. I'm going to click to map. I'm going to start from scratch so you can see the process in its entirety, which is very important. So if I click new, I can select the data source. This is more just metadata. We don't actually connect at this point directly to any of these data sources. This is just to help you stay organized and also to identify potentially to us where we may want to create direct connections. So the name of my object, just to go back, is leads, plural, which is very important. I'm going to make the word leads plural and then my Zoho leads table. Great. So I click create. Now what I need to do is provide Data Tools with a list of all of the fields from Zoho that I want to map. Now, if you watched my last video, we had actually preloaded all of our data into Snowflake, as you can see here. So from my migration stage schema, I have my leads table and I have all of the records. Using a little bit of SQL here, I can actually render the schema from that table. So I'll provide this in the video notes. And I literally can just copy. I can come into Data Tools and I can paste. And now I actually have the lead schema from my Zoho database that came out of Snowflake. If you scan this visually real quick, you'll see that I have a lot of similar column names. They're standard CRM, right? Street, city, state, postal code, etc. So what we've introduced in Data Tools Pro is this auto match concept. And then also once you auto match, we can predetermine the status for the field. So for me, when I auto match, I'm just going to mark it as complete. So when I click save, Data Tools is going to run through and auto match my fields one by one. So now if I click out, I can see at a glance all of the fields that have been completed. There's a couple here that I wanted to take a look at. So my first name, last name. So if I do click to map, and let's look for first name. So you can see here, it doesn't recognize little nuances like underscore. I'm going to click first name. I can quickly toggle left and right to different fields. So luckily I still have name mapped, so I click name. And here, if I wanted to remove it, I can also click remove. This is basically how you would go through and map one by one these different fields. And then let's take a look at name. We can use lead name. I can see postal code is not mapped. Maybe it's zip code. So zip code to postal code. And so now we've got some of the basic mapping complete here. What I'm going to do now is unmap a couple of these fields. Like I know the ID, the is deleted, and master record are not things that I'm going to map. So if you hold the shift key or you hold control and select fields, you can actually bulk update any one of these fields. So I'm going to say, you know what, these are not going to be migrated. I made a little bit of an error. If you click on the edit button, you can set the status for one individual object. And then the other thing that you want to do when you do a migration is you definitely want some type of legacy identifier, an external reference. So what I do is I map this to my record ID. So now what this is going to do for me, and so if I want to reference where this came from, now I have a reference to the original Zoho record ID. So let's clear out the search. And the next thing that I want to do is address the pick lists. So I can come in here and say filter down to my data types for pick lists. So now I just have a list of the pick lists that I want to map. Now, a couple of these I have not mapped quite yet, and that's okay. I can come back to them. As you can see, at this point, I haven't mapped a status yet. So I'm going to map lead status, but this one is going to be a pick list. So I'm going to select pick list, and similar to how we set up our object mapping, I want to provide a list of available statuses that are going to be coming over from Zoho. What I'm going to do is go back to Snowflake, and once again, we have the data already staged up. So I'm going to go to a new tab that I pre-rendered, and I have, with this simple SQL, I can actually select all of the distinct statuses that exist and how many times those instances appeared. And this is part of the collaboration and decision making that probably needs to happen. I'm going to grab these lead statuses. I'm going to come back to Data Tools and paste. And now when I go to mapping, I need to decide for every lead status that I'm anticipating from my old system, what is the new value going to be? So junk lead, for existence, is going to be unqualified. Pre-qualified, I'm going to leave as open. Not contacted, I'll leave as open. Data Tool DTP signup is now Data Tools Pro signup. The null, I'm going to leave open. And contact in future, I'll just leave as open for now. And so you can see, and if you've ever done a migration, you'll experience that there's some business decisions that need to be made at this stage, potentially to identify what's going to be mapped, or potentially you need to actually create brand new pick list values inside of Salesforce. Now, this is saved and ready to go, and we'll see this come up in a moment. I'm going to close out of here. So now I'm going to select everything just to bring us back. And these are generally the fields that I'm going to migrate. What I typically do is go field by field. So you can see there's a whole bunch of Booleans that we've introduced that technically we want to map over. But this goes beyond a simple one-to-one mapping. This is really where you get into logic. And so when you do get into these situations where a one-to-one mapping may or may not work. And so what we do for these situations is we provide a logic tab and a notes tab. To measure activations, you will need production data status. So this is a quick note to myself that we're, at least at this point, we are effectively blocked, right? We don't have the data source mapped. Now, the beauty of this data tools mapping capability is that we could go in and actually add a secondary data source and then do the same kind of mapping. And now in this case, we're taking two source data sources and mapping it to a destination Salesforce. Now, that gets into a little bit more of an advanced topic, which I'm going to cover, but not necessarily live because no one wants to sit here and watch me write SQL live. But I'll cover that in a document that illustrates how I bring this together. And to get a sneak peek of that, let's take a look at what we do with this mapping when we're done. So I've done all the work. I've got my basic data mappings built. How do I get this mapping out into a format that my team can use to actually execute the data migration? Now, historically, what I would do is I would prepare a spreadsheet and I would hand this over to an ETL developer. What we've done is we've baked in some of the SQL code generation into the product itself. So what this has done is it's taken my data mapping and it's generated a SQL select statement, assuming that we have this data mocked up. Now, where we started in Snowflake, you're obviously well aware that we do have this data mocked up and ready to go. So what I can do is I can take this code, copy it, bring it over into Snowflake. I'll just create a brand new tab. I'll paste it. Now I need to select the database and the schema. And because it's Snowflake, I need to actually set up loading. And so it'll actually run this code and produce the data exactly as it needs to exist in order to import this into my Snowflake instance. So in theory, I could take this, download the result, and run this through data loader or really any import staging process. So this really kind of demonstrates the value of staging your data in a data lake like Snowflake, so that once you do your data mapping work, you could very easily take this on into moving it into your new Salesforce instance. Now, one of the things that we started talking about and alluding to is this concept that I actually need multiple data sources blended together to produce our result. Now, this is where you can introduce a common table expression, or CTE for short. And the idea is that we can still use the code generated from Data Tools Pro to give us our data mapping and define our final output. But upstream of that, we can actually select on multiple data sources. So as I mentioned, I need data from my Zoho leads, and then I need some production information related to activations that wasn't being put in Zoho, so that I have a comprehensive backfill data set inside of Salesforce. This is where we would do that work to bring in data from multiple sources securely, blend it together, and then have that blended data source prepared and ready to go right from this CTE. Now, the final question is, okay, I built my CTE. Maybe I don't need to blend multiple data sources. Maybe my migration is really simple. How do I now get this into Salesforce? So that's where we have two options. One is we can export this and run this in the data loader. And the other is something that I'll showcase in my next video, where I'm actually using Azure Data Factory as a mechanism, not just to move one data source, but to move multiple data sources in sequence many times over, knowing that data migration typically is something that you repeat multiple times in order to refine and test. And that's something that we'll talk about in my next video. Now, between now and then, I've got some work to do where I'm going to have to go back, bring in my additional data source, and complete my mapping. So I'll go and work on that, and when we get back together for our next video, I'll show you the completed result so we can dive in and I can show you how I automate the actual data movement process at the end. Hopefully this was helpful. Some show notes, some source code, a link to the article, and everything you need from this video are included in the notes below. Take care.